So the first question, just to get things started, what's the future of the U.S. economy and capitalism?
Who's supposed to answer? Who are you posing it to?
You have a shot at it.
Okay.
Go ahead, Noam.
Well, the first point to mention is that we're very far from a capitalist economy and have never been one. It's a state capitalist economy with substantial state intervention in many respects, from basic research and development to manipulating interest rates to determining the laws, the administrative regulations that permit CEOs to pick their own boards and hence to enhance their salaries, and thousands of other ways. What's the future of it? That depends on how the public will respond to the circumstances in which there are. I mean, there is an institutional logic which will perpetuate things in a certain direction, but it is not graven in stone. It has been in the past and can be in the future influenced, modified, even radically changed by public engagement and action. And there's no way to predict that. Those are matters for action, not for speculation.
Okay, Paul?
Well, I think that's a very insightful view of it. All I would add is that in more recent years, the private interest groups seem to have taken control of the government. That Wall Street, military security complex, agribusiness, the extractive industries, their campaign donations elect the House, the Senate, the President, and they then write most of the bills that the Congress passes and the President signs. So it's a form of state capitalism in which the capitalists seem to have the upper hand. And I think the greed has run away with them to such an extent that they have let it undermine the domestic economy on which they themselves depend. For example, they greatly increased profits and managerial or executive performance bonuses by offshoring so many of the middle-class jobs. Not only the manufacturing jobs, but the professional tradable service jobs such as software engineering, research, design. These things have left, or a large percentage of them, and it erodes consumer purchasing power. The middle class is damaged. The kids who graduate from university expecting jobs find that the jobs are offshored. They've got debts. Increasingly, the big retail box stores just offer part-time employment. You can't form a household on one of those jobs. You can't get married, buy a house. You have to work 2 of those jobs, some people 3. There are no benefits, no pension. The years of zero interest rate in order to save the big mega banks have caused the retired element to have to draw down their savings because they don't get any interest income. And so inheritance for children is disappearing, and so the whole system is become a house of cards. Massive debt and money creation is not matched by the increase in real goods and services. As Chomsky said, the interest rates are rigged. The gold price is rigged. The stock market's a bubble. The dollar's a bubble. In a way, it's a house of cards. And the power of the United States rests to a substantial extent on the dollar being the world reserve currency. And yet, when you create massive new dollars to support quantitative easing, but the goods and services don't increase. You worry the whole world about their dollar holdings. And then you step in and threaten other countries with sanctions, and that gives them an incentive to leave the dollar payment system, which means the demand for dollars drops. So I think the whole thing is a house of cards, and that change could come from a substantial collapse that simply totally discredits the elites in both parties, and some kind of collapse of that extent would give room for the sort of thing Noam mentioned, that people could get back in and be determining factors in the process, and some kind of new leadership could arise. So,
do you have a question for Noam?
No, not about that. I was just adding my 2 cents to his $2 worth.
Okay. Noam, do you have a response to Paul?
Well, I mean, he brought up a great many points. I think a lot of them merit much closer scrutiny and discussion. We don't have time for it now. But I think there's some, I would just like to say that what he's describing, we could disagree about this and that part, but the major picture that he's describing does reflect a certain logic of the state capitalist institutional structure as it now exists. So let's say take offshoring. The CEO of a corporation has actually a legal obligation to maximize profit and market share. Beyond that legal obligation, if the CEO doesn't do it, let's say decides to do something that will, say, benefit the population but not increase profit, he or she is not going to be CEO much longer. They'll be replaced by somebody who does do it. Also, the government has stepped in, partly, I think, because of the enormously increasing power of financial institutions in decision-making in the last generation. It has stepped in to provide mechanisms by which this institutional obligation of CEOs is magnified. For a particular CEO, actually Hacker and Pearson had a good discussion of this years ago. It used to be the case, say 50 years ago, 60 years ago, that the CEO of a corporation had a stake in the survival and growth of that corporation. That's much less true today because of the way compensations are determined. For today's CEO, because of the mechanisms that allow them to essentially set their own salaries, bonus systems, and so on, the incentive is to guarantee profit in the short term, the next quarter, no matter what happens to the institution. That way, they'll become, the multi-billionaires who are forming the fraction of 1% who are designing policy. Those are very perverse incentives, and they are now part of the basic logic of an institutional system that is driving towards serious disaster. Now, I hope we don't have to wait for a catastrophe for the population of the country to act in ways to reverse this. If we do, it'll be, I think, too late. But clearly, these are tasks that have to be undertaken. And there are others. For example, we're marching. Well, there was a big global march, a march on global warming a couple of days ago. Drew a couple 100,000 people to New York. It happened to take place on the same day that an international commission that monitors global emissions reported that global emissions had increased to a record level last year by over 2%, and in the United States by even higher than the global average. Another report predicted that in another it reported that August was the hottest month yet, and that in another maybe 30 years, the number of over 90-degree days in New York would probably triple, with much more dire effects in warmer climates. All of these things are happening, and we're reaching a point of literal no return. If they pass a certain, not very distant level, we can be quite confident that the basis for the decent survival will have been seriously eroded, and we can't wait for a catastrophe to bring a change in policy. That has to be done very quickly.
Now, my next question was going to be about climate change. What role will climate change play in the future of economics and world power balances? Why do you keep going, Noam? No.
Well, if current tendencies persist, we are reaching a point where there'll be a substantial rise in sea level, inundating coastal plains. That could mean millions of people dying in Bangladesh, inundating cities. Most major cities are coastal cities: Boston, New York, San Francisco, others.
Miami.
Right. Yeah, Miami. Much worse in the global South, typically, but other similar. We're already at a level of species extinction that is comparable to what happened 65 million years ago, when a huge asteroid hit the Earth and ended the age of the dinosaurs and opened the possibility for small mammals to survive, ultimately us. That level of species extinction is now being matched, and it's going to increase. All of these are really catastrophic consequences, unpredictable effects. You can't even talk about the global economy. It's going to have far more harmful consequences than that. And it's not that far off. We're marching toward the precipice.
But how will that? I mean, I have to wonder, there are some people and companies that seem to want this to happen. What will happen to the economies of the world and the power balance of the world?
Well, I think this goes back to a point that Paul made. Take, say, ExxonMobil, biggest energy corporation. I mean, it's not that they want these catastrophes to happen. It's that the logic of the institutional framework in which they function is almost compelling them, unless there are external pressures, to march toward that precipice. They have recently announced, ExxonMobil, that they're going to intensify their focus on fossil fuel extraction instead of alternatives, because it is simply so much more profitable. Chevron, another major energy corporation, had a small sustainable energy program that was doing okay. It was profitable, but they just shut it down because the profits are so much greater on extraction of fossil fuels. Within the given institutional logic, you can't really blame the managers and directors for choosing these options. They simply have no choice within that framework, or very little choice. I mean, there was a day when Henry Ford could manage the considerations that Paul was talking about. He could see, I got to pay the workers $5 an hour, or else there won't be anybody to buy my cars. But there aren't. The contemporary institutions don't allow that.
Yes, I can remember. When I was going through university, we were taught that corporations had responsibility to shareholders, but also to employees, to customers, to the communities, and that they had to balance those. But what happened, I can't remember exactly when, but all of the responsibilities were eliminated except to shareholders. And so, as Noam Chomsky said earlier, if you get pressure to move jobs offshore where the labor costs are substantially lower and the profits rise, and you resist, then Wall Street simply says, well, if you resist, we're going to finance a takeover. And we'll have somebody there who will move them. So it's this sort of short-run focus on profits that makes it hard, or in fact I would say impossible, like I think Chomsky believes, for these kinds of issues to be responsibly dealt with. And so if everyone is operating on a short-run basis, focused only on return to executives and shareholders, then you destroy the system. And what surprises me is how many corporate interests fund groups and economists to go around saying that there is no global warming. They still deny it as a climate problem. This is very prominent among what are called free market economists. It's seen as some sort of a government propaganda in order to take over business or to limit growth. If you look at economic theory even, it supports these kinds of notions because the science is built up on a production function known as the Stiglitz-Solow production function, 2 Nobel laureates. And the assumption is that man-made capital is a perfect substitute for nature's capital. And so what that says is you can never run out of resources. And so the whole notion of depletion or depleting the sinks in the environment that can absorb waste, it's difficult to get economists to even think about that. So you even have, on top of the other failures, you have this sort of major intellectual failure.
Yeah, I think
it seems like.
If I could make one suggestion, I'd suggest that you invite Bob Solow on the program, because I'm pretty confident, though he would understand the logic of what Paul just described, he would not accept the consequences. That'd be interesting to hear why.
Well, we can work on that.
I'd
So
like
it seems like both of you agree that it's basically the nature of the corporation that is causing the problem.
It's the incentive. It's the incentives placed before them.
Yeah, exactly.
That's just one of the causes. I mean, Chomsky gave you a number of things. So it's and it's a total lack of any sort of foresight that would come from some ability to plan or lay out possible scenarios that are developing, and then how to minimize the worst ones. Any of that type of thing would help, even though people don't always see the future very clearly. But I just have the feeling if they made some effort, it would be better than just marching ahead with nothing but next quarter's profits in front of their nose.
Yeah. No, that's devastating. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a devastating result.
But we have to remember throughout that what corporations are and what they do and can do is not just up to them. Corporations, after all, are state-created legal fictions, basically. They're created, supported, sustained by state action. And the rights that they have and the options available to them have changed dramatically over the years. So if you go back to the, say, Founding Fathers, the early days of the Republic, corporations had none of the rights that they have today. I mean, a corporation meant basically, say, the people of a town getting together and deciding to incorporate with a specific purpose to build a bridge over the nearby river. And when they did it, that was the end of the corporation. That's basically what a corporation was. It changed began to change through the 19th century. By about a century ago, corporations were gaining personal rights, even though they are incomparable to persons. I mean, for one thing, they're basically immortal. For another thing, they have limited liability. They're sustained by state power in all sorts of ways, and by now they have rights well beyond persons. So, for example, the so-called free trade agreements, which aren't free trade agreements, grant corporations rights far beyond anything that persons have. For example, if Mexico carries out an action which might reduce my future profits from some investment, I can't sue Mexico, but a corporation can under the trade agreements, and they do, and many other things like that. These are all. It even goes down to CEO compensation, which is based on government regulations, mostly in the last 30 years, that have created highly perverse incentives to maximize a very short-term profit, which yields, very high pay, and particularly bonuses and other techniques for the deferred stock options, so on, for the CEO themselves. These are government decisions, which means in principle popular decisions, but only in principle, because unfortunately the public has very little impact on government policy decisions. Actually, there's interesting work on this in mainstream academic political science, which shows very convincingly that the bottom 70% of the population, roughly, in terms of income, is essentially disenfranchised. Their opinions and attitudes have no effect on policy choices. Influence increases slowly as you move up the scale. And when you get to the top, which means really a fraction of 1%, as Paul mentioned earlier, they're basically making policy. Well, that's not a democracy. That's a plutocracy. And until that's changed, we're going to find that this devastating institutional logic will persist.
Yes, I agree with that. I'm not sure that it will change other than a catastrophe collapse that discredits the entire elite structure. Rob, can I change the...
Sure, go ahead.
There's something that I'd really like to know from Professor Chomsky, and that is, what is his take on what seems to me to be the risk that the United States is taking with its European vassal states by pushing them into conflict with Russia that is not in the interest of Europe. And it seems to me that this is a risky thing for Washington, that it could lose control over its vassals if it pushes them into too much conflict that's just clearly against European interest. And for example, what if the Russian government announced that they don't sell energy to NATO members?
Huh.
That would bust up NATO, I think. I don't think that the Europeans could do without supplies for 3 or 4 years, or however long it would take for different infrastructure, assuming there are supplies somewhere. And I just wonder what Chomsky makes of what looks to me like reckless risk-taking on the part of Washington with its own empire by pushing it into conflict with Russia, and perhaps that means also with China, because there seems to be a strategic alliance developing between these two massive countries.
Well, I think that's true. I think it's extremely reckless, and it is driving Russia into an alliance with China. That's been a very conflicted relationship for many years. There's plenty of antagonism. They've almost been a war frequently. But we're driving them together. We're essentially driving Russia into closer integration with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Chinese-based international organization, which has been it's mainly based on energy interchange, energy access, other commercial access, but some have seen it as a potential China-based kind of NATO-style organization. It includes Siberia, India, Iran as an observer, Pakistan, all the Central Asian states, which are big energy producers. The United States wanted to gain observer status, but was turned down. It's kind of developing quietly, like a lot of Chinese growth and influence, but it's substantial. It may also someday be a currency alternative, as Paul suggested. And we're driving Russia into closer connections with it, and this is very risky, and it does even risk major war. I mean, at this point, we are threatening core strategic interests of any Russian government. Can't blame Putin. It'd be any Russian government. You pick it. They would be deeply concerned about a U.S. expansion of NATO, which is a hostile military alliance, right to their heartland. I mean, if the Warsaw Pact were attempting to take over Canada and Mexico, we wouldn't be happy about it. And it's comparable. That is a very good article on this in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, by John Mearsheimer, very well-known IR, international relations specialist. This goes back to 1990, the collapse of the Soviet Union, fall of the Berlin Wall, collapse of the Soviet Union, right in those years. At that point, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was a real statesman, made an incredible offer. He offered to allow Germany to be unified and to join NATO, a hostile military alliance. You take a look at the history of the last, preceding century. That's astonishing. I mean, Germany alone had several times virtually destroyed Russia, even when Russia was supported by the Western power. Now he was offering to allow Germany to join huge Western power, far beyond Russia's, in a hostile military alliance. Now, he did have a quid pro quo. The phrase was not 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase he used together with President Bush, number one, and James Baker, Secretary of State, in working out this issue, also Helmut Kohl of Germany. The 1 inch to the east meant East Berlin, East Germany. The condition was that this militarized united Germany, part of NATO, would not move to East Germany. Well, the Bush administration quickly moved to East Germany. Gorbachev was outraged, but he was informed that it was only a verbal agreement. There was nothing on paper, which was correct. There was nothing on paper. And so he had no basis for objecting. Well, not very convincing, but anyhow, under Clinton, NATO was expanded much further to the east, way beyond East Germany, right to the borders of Russia. Now, the last step, which we're now facing, is the effort to bring Ukraine into NATO. I mean, that's been, now people deny it, but they've been calling for that for years, and the Russians can hear it. That's really right at the heart of Russian basic strategic interests as well as historical connections. But we're pushing it. And that's, risky is kind of an understatement. That's laying the basis for what could become a major war, a nuclear war, which of course destroys everything. And we've come pretty close to that in the past. If you look at the record of the past years since 1945, it's frightening. It's even by accident come very close a number of times. And playing this kind of a risky game is just, I don't know what word to describe it. Suicidal is, again, an understatement. So I agree, it's very risky in all sorts of ways.
Noam, is this due to hubris in Washington, or that they're so determined to have hegemony over the world that they can't think, or they don't see the risk? Because it is such a huge risk, you would think people would be attentive and cautious, and yet it seems like they don't even know it's a risk.
Well, I think that on the part of the general, sort of foreign policy elite, political class, I think they see it as a risk. That's why, I presume that's why Foreign Affairs, which is the main establishment journal, Council on Foreign Relations, why they ran Mearsheimer's article as, in fact, their lead article in the last issue. It's a powerful argument about the risk. But I think Washington, they got their own logic. We've got to maximize our power without limits. I'm afraid I've got to take off. I've just been informed.
Well, it was a pleasure to have a chance to speak with you.
Yeah, good to talk to you. Wish we could continue sometime. Yeah.
We'll leave that up to Rob.
Let's do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Yep.
Stay with us, Paul. Thank you so much, Dr. Chomsky.
Yeah. Bye.